Okay, we're recording at this moment. I would like to welcome you, David Smith, to this call, and actually it's going to be sent out as well to our teachers. You've written the book on Christian teaching, and before we begin to take a look at some of your ideas, I'd like you to maybe introduce yourself or your background to give us a little bit of an idea of where you're coming from in writing this book as well.
Okay, yes, thank you for the conversation. I'm from England. I was born in Lincolnshire on the East Coast. After my studies, I became a teacher. I taught in secondary schools for 6 years before doing graduate study, and I've ended up teaching at a university in Michigan in the United States, where I taught German for a number of years, but now I'm in the education program and I'm a teacher educator. And
Okay.
the university is Calvin University, which some people in the Netherlands know of. It's a Dutch Reformed university.
Okay, thank you. In your book, one of the concepts that you introduce, or as a starting point, is the idea of Zwingli and Augustine, who said that sin was no more than self-love. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this point and why you consider it a starting point for understanding how to teach Christianly, or including Christianity in our teaching.
Well, I think the reason I used that starting point in the book was I had a sense that sometimes when we have conversations about Christian perspectives and Christian worldview, we go off into very detailed philosophical positions that people then have arguments about and so on. And so I wanted to make the experiment of saying, if we begin with something that's very, very simple, that's not the whole of the Christian faith, but it's something that is close to universally accepted within the Christian faith, which is simply love your neighbor as yourself, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And I found this one paragraph that talked about how the Protestant reformers understood that, right? That sin was this turning into yourself, and worship was the opposite. It was turning out from yourself to your neighbor and to God. And so this is something very simple, very basic, and yet it seemed to me that even if you just start from that starting point, that there are things you would have to rethink about schools, about teaching, about learning. To give a really quick example, there's a teacher I know nearby who teaches religion, and he had the practice for a number of years of beginning his classes by putting a quotation on the whiteboard from some great thinker, and then he would have students journal about it for 5 minutes before having a discussion, which is a good teaching strategy. You have better discussions if students have time to think. But he started noticing that students would always begin their journals, I think that, and he started to worry that what he was teaching his students was not that what Augustine said was important, but what they thought was important, that the most important thing is that I have an opinion about Augustine or about Calvin or about C.S. Lewis or whoever. So he changed it. He moved the journaling activity to the end of the class, and he changed the prompt, and he said, I'd like you to write about what you learned from someone else during this class and who that person was and what you learned. So I just look at a simple change like that in someone's teaching, and if you know that at the end of class you're going to have to journal about what you learned from someone else in the room, I wonder how that would change how you listen to other people in the room during that hour as this becomes a habit over time. So I'm really interested in that connection between these really fundamental things that we confess as Christians, and the way we actually structure teaching and learning in classrooms. If this is really a basic truth, that love of God and love of neighbor is fundamental. And so I wanted to try doing that without having to go to any things that are deeply philosophical or controversial or unique to some particular group of Christians. I wanted to see if we could start from some very basic things, but see that they might have radical consequences.
Okay, thank you. So from this basic, actually biblical principle, love God and your neighbor yourself, how did you get to the what if learning framework? Like, how does that tie together then?
Well, if you think about the example that I just gave you of the teacher reconstructing his lesson to try to get students to love each other more, we wanted to break that down into a process that could help us think about it, because it's not very helpful just to say change your teaching, right? Because teaching is very complex. There's too many things going on. So with some colleagues in England and in Australia, we developed a little framework to try to help people to think about this. And step one is about your imagination. We call it seeing anew. So step one is where you ask yourself, does being a Christian give me a different way of imagining the world, a different picture of how things should be? So in the case of this teacher in his religion classroom, he stopped and asked himself, well, I actually want my students to pay attention to the other human beings around them, not just to write school assignments. So that's connected to love your neighbor. So his Christian idea of loving your neighbor gave him a way of imagining what was happening. But so far that's not very useful. That's just imagination. But so the next step is we call choosing engagement, which is how are you going to shape the way that students engage with you and with each other and with the world around them? So what do students actually get to do? So if I talk about loving your neighbor, maybe I do prayers at the beginning of class, or I read a Bible verse, or I have a display up in the school that says love your neighbor as yourself. But then all of the activities are about individual success. Then you get a tension between the imagination that I have and the way that we actually engage with each other. So the next step is to ask, does the way that we engage with each other, is that consistent with the imagination? But then the third layer is reshaping practice. So that actually has us look at all of the physical details of the classroom. So how is the furniture arranged? What pictures do I use? What questions do I ask? What gestures do I use? And in the case of this particular teacher, how do I use time? So what's fascinating to me about that kind of example is he takes an activity, he moves it from the beginning of class to the end of class, and it completely changes the nature of the interaction. He's just changed one little feature of the teaching environment, the time when this happens. And he's also changed the question, the prompt, and suddenly there's a whole new set of dynamics happening. So how can you take all of those practice details and use them to support the kind of engagement that you're looking for to make it consistent with the beliefs that you're claiming?
Okay, I can really imagine, I'm an English teacher, so I'm a language teacher in the Netherlands, and I can imagine applying some of these things to my course. Of course, your book uses your examples as a German teacher, a language teacher, and then we get the physics and the math teacher who say, yeah, but math is just facts. It's just information. How am I going to apply this framework to my chemistry class?
Yeah, of course we don't have time here, for example, in every area. Although there's a math example in the book that I'm not going to tell you about because it will spoil the surprise. But I think of a chemistry teacher that I know who begins one of his lectures. He's actually a university chemistry teacher. Begins one of his lectures by making the lecture theatre dark. He plays some quiet music in the background. He has a sign on his door saying, "Please enter in silence." And he begins the class by having slides on the screen slowly changing with high resolution digital photographs of snowflakes. And they're very, very beautiful, these close-up detailed photographs. And the first 3 minutes of class, the students sit there, it's dark, there are these slides, there's music, there's silence. And he talked to me afterwards. He said one of the things he wanted was that before the students began to think about the chemistry as an academic task, as something for which they could gain credit in school, he wanted them to see that it was beautiful and that it was part of creation. So that's just one small example of someone starting with a different imagination. He wanted his students to focus on beauty and a sense of wonder. And so he changed the details of his classroom, the lighting, the sign on the door, the music, the speed of the slides, to try to get his students to engage in a different way. Well, here's a second example from a physics teacher close by. And this is not directly connected to the physics, so any other teacher could borrow this, but it happened to be a physics teacher. She has every day, each student gets a turn, so a different student each day on a list. each student gets a turn to be the person who is responsible for the well-being of all of the other people in the classroom. So if they do an experiment, that student has to make sure that everyone else has enough equipment to do the experiment before they begin their own experiment. If a student is absent, that student has to notice that that student is absent, send them an email and contact them, and also keep a good set of notes for them from what was covered in class and give them the notes before the next class. And there's a few other things, but there's a student each day who is responsible for the well-being of the other people in the room, and each student in turn, one day at a time, gets that role. So that's a way, again, that she's trying to reconstruct the engagement in her class to make it not just about individual achievement or academic success, but build a particular kind of community. So yeah, we could continue. So sometimes the examples might be directly connected to the content of the discipline, like in the chemistry example, but sometimes it might simply be a question of what kind of community or reality we build together in a classroom that could happen in any subject area.
Okay. As we implement this type of a framework, or thinking at least about worldview and implementing it in our classroom, in our teaching, what are some of the pitfalls we have to be aware of, that we have to keep in mind to prevent this from becoming a superficial or kind of a fake almost, or a exercise, one that's not grounded in reality?
Yeah, I give some examples of this in the first chapter of the book, so I won't talk about those now. Let me talk about a different one. A few years ago, I had a conversation with a student at my own university who told me about a class that she'd just taken. She said at the beginning of the semester, her professor began the semester by talking about how we're going to work together as a Christian learning community. And each of you is made in the image of God. Each of you is important. Each of you has gifts that you can bring to the learning. So it's really important that you come to class every day, that you bring what you have, because we're going to try to be a Christian learning community. And the student said to me, she said, I thought this was really fascinating. I'd never heard someone begin a semester this way before. And it was quite inspiring. I thought, wow, this is actually a really great idea. And then she paused and she said, it took me about 3 or 4 weeks to figure out that it wasn't true. Because the way the class was actually taught, it made no difference whether I came to class or not. It was mostly lectures. It was mostly the teacher sharing information. I didn't get to contribute very much. If I missed a class, it was very easy to borrow some notes and copy down the information and get what I missed. It didn't really make any difference if I was there or not. So in the end, it was just beautiful talk. It didn't actually make a difference to the way that we taught and learned in the class. And I think this is one of the basic challenges of Christian education in the modern world, where it's easy for Christianity to become something you do on Sunday, and outside Sunday, something that you do with words. So our Christianity doesn't structure the way that we buy groceries, the way that we travel around town, the way that the government works, the way that life functions. So what we're left with is words. And then when we try to bring Christianity back to education, the easiest thing for us to add is words. So we do devotions, we have Bible verses, we say Christian things. But if those Christian things, if those Christian words don't describe the actions that we're carrying out as teachers, and not just in terms of character, I'm not just thinking about you being a nice person and being kind to your students, but in terms of how you teach, how you structure the interactions in the classroom, then the words are going to start to sound hollow. They're going to start to sound as if they're not quite true, as if it's just propaganda, it's just marketing. And I think that's really one of the fundamental dangers for Christian education, is that we think that the Christian part is adding some Christian descriptions around what we do, instead of trying to think about how our teaching and learning actions tell stories to our students about what we believe. That's what I'm trying to get at in the book, I think.
So we have to avoid the idea of teaching math, science, English, worldview, or Christian citizenship, physical education, but our whole foundation has to come from that very basic principle of love God and your neighbor as yourself, and that's where it's coming from. That's the foundation then.
Yeah, and all of the rest of the Christian faith.
Right.
So I started with those two pieces because, you know, to show the process, but the whole of our Christian commitment ideally should begin to shape the whole of what we do. And what doesn't work as well is if we just teach math the way we've always taught math, and then add a little talk about Christian worldview in the first week or something, or add a little bit of Christian commentary. Then you're in an image I've sometimes used about this my fear is that in the modern world, sometimes Christian education, it's as if you went to a hotel and you turned on the television and you begin watching a soccer game. And suddenly you realize there's something wrong with the television system in the hotel. And so you're seeing the soccer game, but the sound is coming from the next channel. And on the next channel, they're showing tennis. And so you're watching a soccer game, but you're hearing tennis commentary. And I worry that sometimes that's what we can end up doing in Christian education, where we're playing soccer, but we're talking about tennis. And I want to see if we can find a way of playing soccer and talking about soccer, where we make those connections really really connected to how we think about teaching and learning.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, and it's also a nice taste of what your book is about. Having read it myself, I really, I found myself falling into some of the pitfalls that you mentioned, that I do that myself. And so it was a sharpening for me of my thinking, and putting some of my feelings or my vague ideas, you put them more into words and into ideas. So I really appreciate that. And I really thank you for your time. And I'm sure we'll be able to get a lot of good use from the book you've written. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I hope it's helpful. If you use the bits that are helpful and forget the bits that are not.
Right. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our talk, our discussion.